What exactly does Reconciliation Week mean to you?
It's an extremely important week for First Nations people and me in particular because it's primarily a celebration of two key events, which was the 1967 referendum and also the Mabo decision as well. They're the two key things that the week likes to celebrate. And so there's significant history-making events that happened in that really positive events that happened in Australia's history, where we united around, recognising First Nations people and also the Mabo decision recognising and overturning the law of terra nullius, which was, that the land belonged to no one, and it recognised First Nations people were here and were belonging to the land. And, that for me is, a great achievement and outcome that I like to celebrate each year, and recognise as a nation that we're making that good progress.
What can the tourism sector be doing do you think, to reflect this week and how important it is?
The tourism sectors, in particularly in Queensland, has done a lot in recent years, the last 5 or 6 years, to celebrate and recognise First Nations people's long-standing role in the tourism sector. So I think back in 2019, the Queensland Tourism Industry Council adopted the Larrakia principles on First Nations people's rights in tourism, and have gone on a journey of advocating and working with the Queensland government to having the Year of Indigenous Tourism, a Year of Indigenous Tourism Fund, and celebrating and looking at developing a plan and developing industry protocols and guidelines where First Nations people and non-First Nations people in the tourism sector can work collectively and collaboratively on really exciting areas of tourism development, whether it's the co-design and marketing or product development and experiences. So it's the tourism sector can play such a massive role, and I think as we're heading in this very important year around the yes referendum, and the Uluru Statement of the Heart in 2017 talked about voice, treaty, and truth. Truth telling, the tourism sector has a very strong role in storytelling, and truth telling through storytelling is not only the right thing to do, but it's actually a great tourism add-on and product as well. So I think as we go through the truth telling process, that's a real opportunity for our tourism sector.
Do you think that more travellers are seeking Indigenous experiences, whether they're local? And I'd be interested in your opinion, difference between domestic and international visitors in that space.
I think internationally, there's always been a curiosity because, First Nations people in Australia, it's the oldest living culture. So people coming from outside are always keen, and it's probably we haven't quite effectively given that opportunity or presented or had the environment to allow that. I think domestically, COVID was a game changer in terms of people were staying at home and they were actually reflecting about a lot of things in life. And one of those was about country and where they lived. And what does that mean? It's almost like was a breathing space of contemplation about a whole round of things, which, so the tourism sector, people across the globe, including domestically, there's been a shift towards being a better tourist and leaving stuff, sustainability and leaving the world a better place. And that is understanding about First Nations people and human rights and, caring for country and culture. And to me, I've seen this growing desire to engage with First Nations people and get an understanding about how can we work with First Nations people to have a better environment? How can we look after our tourism assets better, Great Barrier Reef, World Heritage Areas, etc. So yeah, it's a really interesting time where I think everybody's sort of embracing, and I think we're in a moment in time we're talking about treaties, there's been the recognition of First Nations people's rights, and land is being returned to First Nations people where they're unlocking and sharing stories and actually actively engaging. And I think that has provided a big opportunity and just a momentum where people are genuinely interested and want to have authentic engagement with First Nations people.
Keeping in mind that the sustainability of the industry is a critical thing to give overseas visitors, and I suppose to a degree domestic visitors, certainty around the offering. I mean, what do you think are the main challenges to making a more sustainable First Nations tourism sector?
I think there's a few challenges. So, like I said, I think we're only in sort of in a new phase where First Nations people are actively like the return of their lands. They're becoming business owners. They're becoming, drivers and carers of tourism assets, whether it's national parks, whether it's accommodation providers. People are, in airline industry, etc. So there's this growth of First Nations people in the sector, which has challenges from all areas. So we developed a First Nations tourism plan for Queensland 2020-2025, which sort of outlined each area we need to actually work together as industry, government, and community to go forward on, whether it's protocols and guidelines, fake art, coordination and structure. So setting up peak representative bodies that can work with industry and government, marketing, workforce capability for First Nations people in the tourism sector. So there's all these areas that we are in a phase of where by 2032, I think we're looking at that phased approach of actually mobilising and getting things ready and growing our tourism sector across these different elements. And that, I think, presents opportunity for, partnerships with TTF and Queensland First Nations Tourism Council to look at how we work together to collaboratively drive forward those things and look at, unlocking lands for tourism investment, matching up with investors, ethical investors that are going to respect culture and country.
So what do you think are the keys to collaborating and working between what perhaps have been more traditional tourism sector operators and First Nations tourism sectors and operators?
There's a couple of keys to it. I think about mobilising, coordinating, but within our First Nations sector, and mapping and planning out what those key strategies are for connecting and for driving forward on that. And I think then that environment of positivity, of collaboration, and having a clear strategy that's co-designed, that then the resourcing to implement that strategy, whether it's looking at, say for example, it's on Quandamooka country behind me, beautiful Quandamooka country, might be about a great walk. So how that could be an amazing legacy, a 3-island great walk. How do we look at mobilising? Who are the key stakeholders? What's the map and the strategy and plan around that? And how we then collectively resource to develop that together. So that for me is one of the key strategies is empowering First Nations people in the design and buy-in on that, so that we have a clear, mapped out process that everyone's aligned with.
From your perspective, because Queensland is doing so much innovative work in this space, so much of it being driven by yourselves and your organisation, what do you think the lessons out of Queensland are that other states around the country should be picking up on?
One of the key things is working and with our relevant industry bodies. So in Queensland Tourism Industry Council showed great leadership. The regional tourism organisations, they were involved as well, and government. So it was really, the key thing was about empowering First Nations voices. So QTIC enabled through its Indigenous Champions Network, through Destination IQ Forum, allowed First Nations people to drive what they wanted, and First Nations led, supported by industry and government. And that's been really critical for the success of how we've driven stuff in Queensland. And I think the next stage for us is to actually look at that at a national level, how we continue that as national level and feed down into the regional level as well. So getting it more localized. So we look at localized plans and coordination, and that's the sort of thing. And then I think also, as we head towards 2032, it's about how First Nations capacity building is how we spread First Nations tourism in the Pacific family region as well, and how we learn lessons from internationally as well. But Queensland's definitely on the up and up, and I just feel like if we mobilise and get it right, by 2032 we'll be looking back and going, we actually unlocked a First Nations Renaissance period in Australia, and tourism was a major beneficiary because it had been involved in that beautiful process of First Nations empowerment